All right. Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you so much, Arielle. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and speak a bit about your work at Groundswell, and then we'll have time for questions and just discussion and conversation towards the second half as well. So over to you, Arielle.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name's Arielle. It's lovely to meet you all. I am the CEO and a co-founder of Groundswell Giving. We're Australia's first giving platform for climate action. I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people here in Sydney on the Eora Nation, and I want to start by paying my respect to the elders of this place, past, present, and future leaders. Working in climate action and climate justice, where we inherit an incredible living legacy of leadership from First Nations people here in this country and all around the world. And it's a privilege to look to them and learn from them. And in Australia right now, we're going through a pretty heavy moment in terms of reconciling our history with our future. And it's something that it's a reminder to just keep recentering that leadership and looking to it and staying strong even through the hard times, and acknowledging all the hard times going around the world at the moment. And there's a lot of heavy hearts and a lot of doom scrolling, as you said, Suzanne. So feeling that, and there's kind of like, what do you call it, almost all the meta crisis that we're living in, climate and in social and economic justice, they're also interlinked, and climate change is like the most intersectional challenge of all time, as well as the greatest existential challenge we face. So it's a big task, but we're here to talk about hopeful things and the work. And I really, I center myself often in the words of Rebecca Solnit, who speaks about hope. It's not a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. It's the axe you use to break down doors in an emergency. And I see hope in this time as an action. I only have hope because I act, and that keeps me going. So I would like to talk today. Thanks for showing up, and we were just sharing some stories about like our professional backgrounds and what brings us here. So if you haven't shared yet, I'd love it if you did share, whether you're working in climate or interested in working in climate, where you've come from, why you're here. It will help me sort of anchor this talk. And I thought I'd start by sharing my story, how I got involved in working in the climate movement and setting up this organisation, Groundswell. And then also I wanted to speak about the different, I suppose we work with a theory of change, as many others do. So I thought I might talk about some of the areas that I think are really useful for catalysing impact on climate at this point in time. And then we're going to have a bit of a question and answer, and hopefully a really interesting discussion. So my story, I definitely haven't spent my entire life working in climate at all. I used to be a book designer, and then an illustrator, and then a curator. And I suppose that also, I could wind it back even further. I grew up in bushland. My parents were artists. I grew up around storytellers and writers. My dad was a kids' book illustrator. So we always grew up with like stories as the backbone of our life. And that's been a real anchor throughout my life. So that's leaving school. I thought about doing law, and I actually started learning about torts and jumped quickly out of that one and went into making pictures and finding different ways to engage people with stories that I was interested in. And I did that for many years, and I would do volunteering projects on the side. I did a lot with koala conservation on the coast of Australia. But to be honest, I think I was sort of skating along the surface of things. I wasn't looking too hard. I was enjoying myself and doing that as my sort of outside job, but not really anchoring my purpose in my career. I loved stories, and I was good at telling stories, and I loved particularly working with really complicated stories and helping people find ways in. But I hadn't really connected the dots between my purpose and my career. So I suppose that carried on for a while, and then I was in my late 20s and I was living in London, and I was working in publishing and doing all sorts of other creative things. And then I got a call from my father, and he told me that he had cancer. He was given 3 months to live. He asked if I could come home and look after him, and so I did. And so I tied up my life and I jumped back on a plane, and I went to like country New South Wales in Australia. So that bushland that I grew up on, I was back there. And caring for him, I had this time out of life to really sit and reflect and think about the time that we have here, you know, how finite it is, to really think about purpose. Dad his books were sold all around the world. He, you know, created this love of reading with generations of kids. And I thought about what I was doing and the legacy that I was leaving, and I just didn't feel that it was what I wanted it to be yet, that I wasn't on my track yet. So I had this time out to really reflect on that. And at the same time, I was spending a lot of time sitting very quietly in nature and thinking about all those big things. I could see that the creek that used to run through our local town had dried up. I could see that we were experiencing an extended period of drought. I could see all of these things that I tried to push away for a while. And I was spending a lot of time re-engaging with Australian politics, getting increasingly incensed by it, and starting to really wonder and think deeply about how to connect the dots between what I cared about, what I was good at, and what I wanted to see happen in life in the world. So that did pass, and I made a bit of a resolution to do things a bit differently. And so at the time, I started an arts advocacy project around what we call the Nauru files, which were leaked incident reports from Nauru Offshore Detention Centre detailing abuses of about a couple of thousand people who were detained there by our Australian government, people who were, you know, fleeing war and seeking help and safety and were being abused by our government. This amazing piece of journalism by The Guardian exposed them, but they really weren't connecting with the Australian public in a way that I felt that they could. And for me as a book designer, I started to join dots and start to think about different ways into stories that matter. And so I created this art show, asking Australian artists and artists in detention to respond to the incident reports. And it turned into quite a big thing. We partnered with Human Rights Watch and The Guardian, and that show ended up touring around the country. Amazing women, one Claire, who's one of the Groundswell co-founders, who provided funding to help the show tour nationally and helped provide funding to start pitching stories to media and all of this. We got a lot of traction with it on an issue that was very hard to cover. And then I met our third co-founder, Anna, who is a 20-year climate campaigner, and she gave us advice on how to maximize the political opportunity. And we ended up installing the art show on the foyers of the Labor Party's National Convention as part of a joint advocacy effort to increase pressure for better policy outcomes at the next election. And we were part of the campaigns around Kids Off Nauru and the Medivac bill and things like that. So for me, that was sort of my trial by fire into the world of advocacy, but also creative ways of doing things. I didn't have to go back to school and study law or, you know, political theory or anything like that. I could use my existing skill set and creatively apply it to issues that I cared about. Meeting Claire and Anna through this process, they were working already deeply in the climate movement and climate action, and I started to learn from them. A few other things happened around that time. I read one of the IPCC reports, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. I'd never read one of these reports before. I don't know if anybody else has read them or read them in full. They're long and they're deep in scientific knowledge, and they're quite impenetrable texts. And what they tell us is incredibly important, but they can be hard to connect with and they can be hard to cover through media and things like that. But when I did, I sat through and my book designer mind was like, okay, let's get involved. I was really horrified when I read the scientific reality where we were at that point. That was around 2018 that I read that report. I had told myself until that point that the grown-ups were in charge, and then that things were bad, but like they would sort themselves out. There were lots of clever people, much cleverer than me, working very hard on this, and surely things would just come out okay. But meeting Claire and Anna, two very clever people working very hard on this, and reading the IPCC report, which is basically like, everybody get mobilized now, go. I realized that, yes, a lot of very clever people were working very hard on this, but it wasn't enough. And my favorite climate scientist, Professor Leslie Hughes, talks about climate knowledge. I'm not sure how I feel about this word, but she calls it toxic knowledge, or the Hotel California. Once you understand the reality of the science and the urgency of the moment, you can't unknow it, and it propels you to action. It's very hard to step away once you understand what's truly at stake. You've got to look it in the face and get on with being part of the solution. So that was sort of in many ways my aha moment. And then I also worked on an incredible book called 2040, which was the book accompanying a film by an Australian filmmaker called Damon Gameau. And it was inspired by the book Drawdown by Paul Hawken, talking about all the incredible existing solutions we have to solve this thing. And learning from my colleague Anna, I realized we have all of these solutions, from, disrupting climate finance to microgrids of electricity to, empowering women and girls. There are so many solutions that exist, but what we're lacking still, in fact, the real barrier that we've always faced is that lack of political will. So that got me excited, and that got me stepping in. So after we had an election where a climate denier got into power, and the next day I reached out to Claire and Anna, and I said, I'm coming to work with you guys. I don't care what you're doing, I'll just shadow you. So I spent about 9 months shadowing them. I went part-time with my work and volunteered to just learn and soak it up and go to every talk I could. This was pre-webinar as a regular sort of thing, but I went to a lot of talks, read a lot, and just learned. I just found good people doing great things, and I went along for the ride. And that's something that I've consistently found with the climate movement. It is the most welcoming place out there. Everybody wants you, because everybody needs you, and there's a lot of support along the way. So after about 9 months of learning and soaking it all up, I partnered up with Claire and Anna, and we launched Groundswell, Australia's first giving platform for climate action. So the role that we were trying to fill was basically there is an incredible ecosystem of very effective climate advocacy organisations working in Australia and the world at large, but across the board, they're all held back from delivering on their potential for impact by a critical lack of funding. Globally and in Australia, giving to climate and the environment, it's less than 2% of all giving. So to put that into real world figures, in Australia, well, actually global trends, last year the brand Lululemon brought in more money than all global giving going towards mitigating climate change. It's absolutely woeful how little money it gets in the grand scheme of things. And although climate impacts are accelerating, the level of funding isn't stepping up to the opportunity. And the thing about funding for climate and environmental advocacy is that this is a political challenge that requires political solutions. It requires that external pressure and in-track pressure to get the outcomes and the solutions we need. Because of that, it's not going to receive climate funding from government. And because it doesn't make you money, it just secures a safe future. It's not as attractive to the impact investment crowd. Its outcomes are social, environmental, and actually economic outcomes, but it's a harder case. So what we really wanted to do was tell the story. We launched during the Black Summer bushfires, when the skies here in Sydney were just thick with acrid orange smoke. We lost 3 billion animals during those fires that raged for months and months. It was a big wake-up call for a lot of Australians about, until then, climate change had felt like quite an abstract concept, something of scientists and so on, and then it arrived. you couldn't breathe. Over 80% of Australians were affected by that smoke. And there was this kind of, we landed in this really interesting moment. Until then, most funding going towards climate and environmental solutions had been geared at recovery after disasters. And so we were able to arrive at this moment where people were going, well, actually, no, we need to look at mitigation. Who's funding that work? And so Groundswell was able to inhabit this space as a bit of a welcome mat for the climate movement, to, one, fund really impactful climate advocacy, and two, to teach people about what that climate advocacy looks like. Who are these groups? Climate change is this sort of big concept, you know, its whole systems change, and it can feel quite overwhelming knowing where to step in and deliver impact. But being able to, my skill set in this instance was synthesizing movement expertise into language and frameworks that people like me and my friends could access and understand, and then get, you know, basically cut out the middleman. So since launching, we're going into our 4th year, we've been able to raise and distribute over $2 million to the climate movement. We've made 70 grants. We have a community of 700 regular givers. We have a larger community of 12,000 people giving. We've got members all around the country and international members as well. And it's been this really beautiful thing of connecting dots between the people with solutions and the people who want to see impact. But, you know, we can't all quit our day jobs and become a climate activist. And we've seen a lot of great work. Like, we've been able to fund strategic litigation. We've been able to fund traditional owners protecting their country against gas exploration. We've been able to fund, you know, people protecting old growth forests. And, you know, last year, one of our states drew an early end to logging of their old growth forests. All of these kinds of wins and these kinds of organisations, none of them is a silver bullet, but they work in an ecosystem that collectively builds that pressure internally and externally on government to deliver wins. And that has been how social change has happened throughout history. And I suppose we love that kind of movement ecology and that overview that we're able to bring as a funding organisation, being able to platform these amazing organisations, as well as fund the sort of movement as a whole. And we have, I mean, we have done a lot, but there's a lot more to do. So we're always thinking about how we can grow and evolve. And we've had to be really agile and pivot a lot over the last 4 years. It's been really interesting. We just thought we were going to be a small little giving circle, and it's turned into quite a bigger thing. But there's a lot of support available from the climate movement and all of the advisors that I've been lucky enough to be able to lean on, you know, going from a book designer to running a startup climate change charity. It's been an interesting journey, but I've been very well supported through that. And it's, you know, you talk about your different growth phases. There's like stretch and panic. I've sort of teetered in between stretch and panic a fair bit, but I'm in stretch now, which is great. And you just sort of get through it. Our funding also really prioritizes climate justice as the foundation of what we do. It's, you know, as we all know, like, climate change is deeply intersectional, and those affected first and worst have done the least to cause it, with the least capacity to adapt. So we really take climate justice seriously and think about it as a foundation to the decisions that we make, a lens over the decisions that we make, and a strategy as well. So making sure that we're thinking about that very deeply. So I might pause there. That's sort of my, like, how I got to Groundswell and climate. But I thought, and I'm happy to pause for questions, but I thought it might be interesting at the next point to go into the sort of framework of, well, what does climate action look like? What are those 4? I'd like to take you through 4 key impact areas, part of our theory of change, which we identify as building the movement, changing the story, shifting the money, and changing the politics. And I can unpack them a bit and give some examples of some really cool stuff that I see in action and that we identify as really interesting areas to get involved in. So I might just take a breath and see if there are any questions, and then we can dive in again.
Yeah, thank you so much for... Oh, go ahead, Mick.
I was just wondering, who are those givers? And obviously don't need to have names or anything, but like just what kind of people or organizations are those givers, and how do you decide how to distribute those funds?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Great question. So our members are everybody from young parents to grandparents to farmers to business folk. We've got quite an interesting spread. A lot of our members are in capital cities, so Sydney and Melbourne, but we also have a lot of folk who live regionally who pitch in as well. What I really like about our model is it really prioritizes community-led organising. We like to instead, there's a real trope in Australia, and I'm not sure if you have a similar thing over in Canada, but there's this real disdain, and it's sort of an identity politics that's been weaponized around inner city lefties, sort of dictating to the people from regional and rural Australia or regional and rural areas. They're out of touch with the lived experience of climate change and cost of living and all that kind of stuff. With this model, we don't dictate what those communities should do or how they should do it. We fund the communities already doing the work. And I think that's a really beautiful model for the people in the cities who want to see change, to fund the communities already leading the change. How we make decisions about funding, we run grant rounds. So we have 2 grant rounds a year. We open them up for applications. We tend to receive around 40 to 50 applications from groups. The grants that we offer range between $40,000 and now $80,000. So the more members who join, the more grants we can fund. So the first grant round was $50,000. Our last grant round was nearly $400,000. We have a shortlisting committee of strategic advisors, so experts working within the climate movement on top-level strategy, as well as a rotating committee of members who get to sit in and vote on those decisions at that advisory. We do at Groundswell a top-level due diligence audit, and then we spend nearly 3 weeks with the shortlisting committee reading, reviewing, and assessing, and break it down to a shortlist. That shortlist of applications then goes out to all of our members to vote upon, and the organisations with the most votes win the grants, or win the greatest grants as well. And we have, as part of our commitment to climate justice, we offer gratis memberships to First Nations members and change makers, and we pay for their time to sit on the shortlisting committee at every grant about decision-making processes. And so it's really interesting. Members get really engaged. We offer all of our communications in like short form and long form. So if you want to, you can go and do an audit of their last year's financials. Like one of our early members, Rod from, I think it was Tenterfield, called up one of the grant winners, Climate and Health Alliance, and was quizzing them about the budget. So we put in a bit of scaffolding because we're really conscious of not wanting to take up too much of those climate organisations' time. But yeah, you can sort of engage as lightly or as deeply. Some people just want to fund and know that it's being handled well. Some people really go into it, and I love all of those different interactions. It's really interesting. Yeah, so it's a really engaging process. We have incredibly high retention of members, which I think is testament to how good it feels to be part of it and vote on when your money goes, and then see the stories. And we love telling the stories about grant winners too, obviously. And I think that's an interesting one as well, because advocacy, the work that we're doing, it exists within that movement ecosystem. So it's not you plant a seed and you see a tree. You're operating in a complex political landscape, and it's hard to claim victory over everything, over any one thing. But all of those pressure points build and they create meaningful outcomes. So part of our role as communicators is speaking to that and helping to build that kind of civic literacy, political literacy, that sort of complex story about how change happens. That's a really interesting one. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed.
Any other questions?
I do.
Yeah.
Hello. What you said just earlier around funding and some of these organisations not getting the funding they deserve. I think you said something to that effect, but it just made me think of an event I'm going to this Thursday, which is a climate tech showcase, and a bunch of startups are presenting to investors and pitching, their companies, and I guess I just would be curious to know your thoughts on the kind of climate tech industry versus, and whether there's sort of a difference if they're sort of positioned differently to the organisations that you support and fund. And I guess, your feeling around that space. I guess I also raise it because I often think people get, myself included, get very caught in the hype around tech and the buzz around that space. And I guess I'd be curious to know how you see it.
Yeah, look, I think there are a lot of it's a really exciting and emergent space. There's a lot of creative people working really hard to invent the new circular economy, and I think that's fantastic and needs to happen. I think of this change, I don't know if any of you have heard of a thinker called Daniel Schmachtenberger. I might share a few links. He's a really interesting thinker who talks about global catastrophic risk and the climate crisis and how we can come. Pardon me?
He's from Allfed.
Allfed. I'm not sure.
Allfed. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yes, sorry.
Not at all.
I've been speaking this week. I think he's from an organisation called Allfed.
Okay. So he's speaking about systems change and how we uncomplicate ourselves from this incredibly complex system that we've built with fossil fuel and energy primacy at its heart. I think a useful way to think about change is through triage, transition, and transformation, these three horizons of time. So triage, what are the immediate things that we need to do right now to stop warming going past 2 degrees? Transition, what are the sort of connective tissues that we need to be building and investing in to get through it? And then transformation, what is the new system? There's lots of different opinions about that new system. I am incredibly wary about tech optimism and Australia repositioning itself from one extractive economy into another. And I think globally that's a perpetuation of colonial harm. We're looking at, the Western Australian Pilbara region, one of the world's largest depositories of lithium, again, over in Central America. That's where the capitalist forces of the world are looking to. What kind of sovereignty those countries and people will have, is being drawn up right now. I don't have faith that it's going as planned. So I think, that's one end of the climate tech conversation that I have concerns about, and that we're sort of getting to. I think every conversation that we have, every story that we create is important, because it's how we sort of position, we're building the plane while we're flying it, right? We need to decarbonize rapidly, absolutely. For me, I like the climate tech conferences and a lot of the impact investment work that operates very much in the transition part of the world towards transformation. And I think it's necessary and important and exciting. I think sometimes impact investment doesn't realise that unless we deal with the triage work, shiny tech solutions won't add up to all that much. Because if we don't keep coal and gas in the ground effective immediately, if we surpass that 2 degree limit, the tipping points that it will set off in the Earth's climate system means that we'll never be able to restabilize. And because of that, our economic, food systems, all of this will go into different stages of collapse. So I think it's important to recognize that we do need to be building those new economies, but we need to dance through those 3 horizons, to use somebody else's beautiful analogy. So at Groundswell, the way that we think about how our work feeds into those 3 horizons, the triage work is funding those frontline climate activist groups to keep fossil fuels in the ground. It's funding litigation to change the laws so that government can't keep greenlighting new coal and gas mines. It's funding an amazing agency called Comms Declare, who's working on pressuring advertising to stop working with fossil fuel sponsorships, sports stars to stop working with fossil fuel sponsorships to end that social license. So I'll talk through those different frameworks that we work at. And the climate justice imperative is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about transformation. So if we let business and the big end of town dictate this transformation, we're going to end up with a similar levels of brokenness. The more that we can empower communities to lead and dictate the terms of their transition, the more I think we'll arrive at outcomes better for people and planet. I think we really need to think a lot about colonialism and neocolonialism in this conversation. And I think it's wonderful to see opportunity and to see possibility. And we certainly do have all the existing solutions we need to decarbonize rapidly. But for example, the nuances of that between, do we just turn every car on the road into an EV and go into a mode of endless extractivism? Or do we reimagine how we use cities and active transport and things like that? So all of these emergent conversations I think are really interesting. And maybe that was a little bit of a rabbit hole one, but I can...
Amazing response. Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. Any other questions? All right, well, why don't we talk through the theory of change that we talk about within this triage landscape, and the kind of elements that can add up, that we think will add up, combined in an ecosystem to get the outcomes we want to. So I love Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, talks about what we need right now is everything, everywhere, all at once. And my response is like, thank you, Tony, but that's a lot. And we need to break it down into tangible pieces. You know, the biggest thing holding us back isn't like lack of opportunity, it's complete and utter fucking overwhelm. And that can be a real barrier to entry. So frameworks help. So this framework was developed in collaboration by Climate Action Network Australia and Sam LaRocca, who is one of the leaders at Sunrise Project, which is one of Australia's leading climate strategy groups. They're very brilliant. And it goes through building the movement, changing the story, shifting the money, and changing the politics. Together, this sort of 4-part framework for action feeds itself, it becomes stronger than the whole, it diminishes the power of the opposition, and it secures outcomes for a safer climate. No one thing, no one silver bullet will get us the outcomes that we need, but together, these levers, and I think this really applies at a global level. This isn't just an Australian lens, and forgive me for talking with quite an Australian lens, but this is something I talk to international colleagues about as, you know, the different parts of systems change. So first prong being movement building. Well, politicians only ever aim as high as citizens demand, right? They're not going to act at the scale we need to unless we're there pushing them, asking for it. Similarly with business and with polluting businesses, they're only going to take a stand when their consumers demand it or their brand is at tangible risk. So we need hundreds of groups building a movement powerful enough to force governments to deal with the root causes of this. And in Australia and across the world, multiple governments have been influenced to a great degree by corporate actors. So receiving political donations, revolving doors between parliament houses and industry. It's a big thing to shift up, but with enough public pressure, it's absolutely possible. So the main piece of advice that any kind of climate campaigner will give you is when getting involved, raise money and join existing climate groups. There are so many different groups out there that you can support with time and money. So whether that's specific advocacy for young people, psychologists, health professionals, parents and surfers, athletes, there's a very diverse range of groups. And I love learning about international groups and the work that they're doing. Right now, it's very important that we're engaging with conservative groups, with regional groups, with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So a lot of the environment movement has been white and relatively privileged. We really need to break out of that and empower groups from different areas to step up on behalf of their communities. They're already doing it. Often it's a matter of plugging them in and getting funding there. And again, that's the conversation about the difference between climate action and climate justice, whether communities are dictated to or empowered and resourced to lead. I think around the world, we're sort of seeing this rise of populism and far-right governments and movements and post-truth age, disinformation, all this kind of thing. Something that I found very interesting and that I'll talk about a bit later is the need for the progressive left to really reckon with our own language and the moral foundations that we approach conversations with. We have become increasingly puritanical, and it is having a ricochet effect. And that's, I think, an interesting kind of piece of work in building bridges with people whose political ideas and values are different to ours. How do you bridge those divides rather than strengthen and widen them? And yeah, it's a big area to engage with, but grassroots community groups and real conversations actually are very, very powerful things. The second chunk of work, changing the story. So building urgency for more ambitious action, centering First Nations ways of knowing, removing social license for continued pollution, and changing information environments for decision makers. We're not punching in the dark anymore when it comes to telling the climate story. There's incredible research out there about effective ways of storytelling to bridge those sort of ideological divides. Here in this country, a researcher called Dr. Rebecca Huntley put together a piece of research called the Climate Compass, which maps Australian attitudes towards climate change. That built on research done over in the States through Yale, and it segments the population into different feelings about climate change. So there's the alert, which is the majority actually. There's alert, cautious, concerned, disengaged, and a kind of disbelieving one down the bottom. Right now, here in this country, only 5% of people are active climate deniers. Most people, nearly 80% of Australians get that climate change is here, it's happening. How much they think we should do, that's the bit to influence. It was higher more recently with cost of living. It's gone down as a priority, but climate change is still, I think it's number 4 top priority for voters at the moment. But I suppose changing the story can look like lots of different things. It can look like conversations with friends and family. It can look like resourcing artists, writers, storytellers, filmmakers, working on TV breakfast hosts, working with local grassroots groups. Think about how culture is shaped in our country. Who shapes it? And we really need to think especially about who shapes centrist culture, because centrist culture creates the social norms which politics will operate within. So at the moment, to give you we're working on a bit of a research piece around that and looking at cultural pillars as everything from sports to faith groups to local community groups to TV to podcast to radio. And we're mapping out who those key influencers are, how they feel about climate, and looking at strategies to engage and work with them and bring people into the climate. One big learning is that shame doesn't work. real connection does, listening first. It's kind of a trope, but you have to listen first and truly understand. And there's a great thinker called Jonathan Haidt who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind about that, which is really interesting. If you haven't heard of that, I'd recommend giving it a read, about how to connect with people who think differently to us. So we need to be, and I might just, a couple of other really interesting organisations. I mentioned Comms Declare, who are doing work to keep advertising fossil fuel free, and recently they won a campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising in the city of Sydney. You know, we have this opportunity and we need to turn the fossil fuel industry into the tobacco criminal, because that's exactly what they were doing. This industry hired the same PR machine that the tobacco industry used back in the 80s to create this whole system of denial and delay. So there's a lot of work to be done about removing their social license, and it's certainly something that's massive here in this country. And I love this quote again, Rebecca Solnit. I just have like notebooks of her quotes, which I go back to. We find our artists to take us through and give us those stories, but political change often follows culture. What was long tolerated is seen to be intolerable. What was once overlooked becomes obvious, which means every conflict is in part a battle over the story we tell, or who tells it and who is heard. And we need new voices telling those stories, and particularly diverse voices from culturally, linguistically diverse communities. Also, like really just looking at the amount of money that goes into telling the story, from Murdoch Media to fossil fuel lobby. We really need to invest in better climate storytelling, more climate storytelling. A really phenomenal person called Melinda Wink, who's produced 2040, that film that I mentioned earlier, Frack Man, another great film about a guy who took on gas fracking. They made an incredible film about it, actually, and at the start of the film campaign, it was 98% of New South Wales was covered in gas exploration licenses. By the end, there was no licenses anymore. It was one of those storytelling moments and impact campaigns that was so powerful, it really did translate into tangible change. And she writes about, or she talks about this moment and the stories that we need as not one narrative for all, but an avalanche of diverse narratives. An ecosystem of narratives as diverse as the systems we're seeking to save. And I love that, the kind of multitudes of stories, climate stories for different communities. Third part of the framework, shifting the money. This is such an interesting space and such a fast-moving space. So it's divestment, cutting off the funds, financing new fossil fuel projects, but also active shareholder activism. So people buying into companies that are doing bad things and using their shareholder power to influence the decision-making processes and to accelerate their decarbonisation. So a really beautiful example of that was partnership, was AGL here in Australia, had become our largest emitter. It was an energy company, had become our largest emitter. The Sunrise Project, together with this Australasian Centre of Corporate Responsibility, partnered up with a number of players actually, and created a campaign which started to buy up shares in AGL to get more decision-making power. And eventually Mike Cannon-Brookes came on in 2019 and was able to buy majority shares and use them to force the company. They were planning to do a demerger, which would have meant that they would have been able to sell off the worst polluting part of their business in order to meet their goals, which meant that part of the business could have kept on polluting indefinitely. But Cannon-Brookes and this amazing sort of group of different power players bought up the majority shares and forced AGL not to demerge, but instead to absorb that within the business and rapidly decarbonise it, and effectively cut off what could have extended Australia's emissions by a lot longer. It was a really interesting action. So ACCR are doing incredible work. I also There's a great guy called Tim Buckley, who's Director of Climate Energy Finance here. He's like a guy in his 50s with a couple of Labradors that he trains up as guide dogs. He lives in the suburbs. He also worked with BlackRock to basically work with them to dump more than $500 million in thermal coal shares from all of its actively managed portfolios. And he did that because he saw an opportunity. He approached Larry Fink and he worked with him to build the architecture to do it. All these humble, amazing people just going about interesting, creative strategies to accelerate the exit from fossil fuels. So Market Forces is a really interesting organisation to watch as well. Beyond finance, there's just so many sectors in the corporate world, and I'm just so excited about Terra-Do and what you're doing and the fact that you've come out to Australia because there's so many ways to shift money through different businesses. The law profession here is full of people working to protect the fossil fuel industry and polluting industries, the advertising industry, caterers, conference centres, hospitality workers. Like, so many sectors are entwined still in relationship to this, and there still is very low climate literacy in many corporate sectors about the climate reality and what needs to happen. So no matter what sector you're working in or that your professional background is in, there are so many levers for change. And again, I can't stress enough how much group collective action works. So finding like-minded people within your sector and collaborating with them for that bigger sort of systems architecture. So new groups that I've seen spring up just in the past year, Lawyers for Climate Justice, working on building pressure on the legal profession and building education for the legal profession about climate reality and what needs to happen. Like, we all know what it feels like to have our blinkers on and just, you've got your stress, you've got your mortgage, that's a problem for another day. But joining together with a group of like-minded people, you can create a lot of momentum. There's a great platform here called Work for Climate that gives resources and support for people working within their industries. So that's a really interesting place, but also come talk to us at Groundswell. We help a lot of groups set up and start up and get off the ground. And then the last part of the strategy is changing the politics. So last year here in Australia, we had the climate election, which was the result of tens of thousands of people showing up, mobilising and getting involved where they hadn't been before, but it was also building on years of work by the climate and environmental movement in building education, awareness, engagement. Right now, here and globally, we have governments who say they're doing enough and who just aren't. So we're living not in this age of denial anymore, but of delay. And global pledges to climate change add up to our atmosphere warming 2.8 degrees by the end of the century. And we know that 1.5 is the limit where things start to unwind, and 2 degrees is the point of we can't ever bring things back into stability. So we have this incredibly short moment, and we have a lot of work to do on political opportunities. The COP negotiations, so the UN climate talks, are big moments. We've got one coming up at the end of November, beginning of December. Australia is likely going to host the COP talks in 2026. So we're all thinking about that moment and starting on early convening work with international funders and strategists. A Pacific Climate COP, if we're actually going to host this in partnership with the Pacific, who's, for them, 1.5 degrees means homes or no homes, that is not a throwaway number. That has to become the baseline of it. So the goal that we all want to work towards here is a fossil-free COP. How to do that? We won't, it's really interesting, right? When we think of tipping points and the kind of change that we need a complete change. We need a complete reimagining we need a completely new Overton window for politics to operate within. Change can be built through tipping points of movements, And that's what we're all here and doing, building all this pressure for increasing levels of positive tipping points, not negative atmospheric tipping points, but positive tipping points for exponential change. And that can feel like you're Sisyphus rolling a ball up the hill and it comes down on you, and you're rolling and it comes down, it can roll up. But at some point you get to enough momentum, enough pressure, and then you're in an entirely new landscape. So there's the sort of, we're looking at tipping points we can plan towards, like COP26. There will also be extreme weather events, which are going to be really important to mobilise energy and support around. The next time we have an extreme weather event here in Australia, we have to use that to maximise political ambition, community pressure, all of these things. That's a hard conversation to have in advance and to think about, but we must really use those moments to do a lot. So, for example, if you're working within a corporate firm and there's, you know, an environmental tipping point moment, humans are really good at responding in emergencies. We're not good at responding to future threats, but emergencies we mobilise and we really all get towards solutions. So the more that we can use those emergency moments to maximise the support and the ambition, the better we'll be. And we also have a federal election. I'm not sure. I think it's going to be a bit of a tricky one. Again, a lot will depend. Things can change overnight, and we've lived through a pretty radical few years with COVID and all of this, and we're going into a new era of global instability. So we have to be adaptable, and we have to look after ourselves in the process as well to stay strong. So I suppose thinking about positive tipping points, what are they? How can we build with them? But when it comes to engaging with the government, engaging at a local level, at a state level, at a federal level, it's absolutely critical. Where our impact is multiplied when we join with advocacy groups, it means that we can operate a bit more strategically. Our voices can get louder. I'd also say politicians are people, and there's a place for criticism and shame, but carrots also work. So think about that in your planning as well. You know, how can we create more hero pathways for government? I do think this government in Australia wants to do more, but they need more hero pathways, and we need to inoculate the opposition. Two-party systems are very, very hard. I also think that the litigation is absolutely critical when it comes to politics, and we're seeing more and more strategic litigation of people taking governments to court over inaction on climate, and that's really one to look at, invest and support, because that changes the playing field for what is possible within politics. So that's the sort of outline of the frameworks there. And I guess I'm just going to my notes. Yeah, there's not a one size fits all plan, but something that I really love, a framework that I love about thinking about how to tie your superpowers into this movement. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is a Brooklyn-based marine biologist who's now a climate and policy expert, and she came up with a Venn diagram, which is what brings you joy, what are you good at, and what needs doing. And I think that's a beautiful place to come back to and reflect on. And yes, I might stop talking there and go to let's have a chat.
Yeah, thank you so very much. That was a really great framework to understand as well. We are at time at the hour, so if we've somehow zipped through the hour. But if Arielle, if you have a couple more minutes, maybe we could stay back for one or two more questions. And just before, if anyone needs to drop off, no worries on that. I'm just gonna quickly run a poll just to get your feedback on the event as well. But feel free if anyone
while I'm live. I don't think I could take that.
Feel free
to yourself. Yeah.
Feel free to go off mute right now and ask questions if you'd like. Oh, Suzanne, are you?
Oh, sorry. So good. Someone else go. I've already asked.
No, I think I thought Mick was going, sorry.
No, go for it. Oh, wait.
Okay, Suzanne, how about you kick us off?
I always do this, sorry, Shamali.
Please go ahead.
So one of the things about climate activist groups that has always sort of frustrated me is that there's so many of them, and it seems like they spend so much time begging for money rather than, you know, being able to channel their efforts into their causes. And I think the diversity of groups, you know, you've sold me on that idea. I think that's really important. But is there a way to get some of that money from the oil, some of that subsidy money that goes to the oil and gas companies, or some like big chunks of change that, you know, that could be used by these groups?
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about propositioning oil and gas companies. I think it would get a bit complicated with power dynamics, but
no, it's more like getting the money that the governments are giving them already.
Oh, the fossil fuel subsidies into,
yeah.
I guess, yeah, I mean, like in Australia, it's $11.1 billion went in taxpayer subsidies to the fossil fuel industry last year. It's absolutely something that people are working on. I can see how it could be redirected, and this is one of the asks from the COP negotiations, that it's redirected into loss and damage. So supporting groups in the Pacific and in the Torres Strait and around the world to adapt and build resilience. The challenging thing is because advocacy directly challenges government. Government can't give them taxpayer monies to challenge itself. And I think that's the crux. So Groundswell started up basically because we wanted those groups to stop wasting their time fundraising and to maximize their time on the impact. And this is the reality. Like there are like a lot of very, very grassroots groups, the kinds of grassroots, but the kinds of groups that we fund are maybe like one step above, playing very specific roles for very specific sectors, whether it's Farmers for Climate Action, Environmental Defenders Office, Environment Centre Northern Territory. They're sort of playing to very specific communities and strategies. Often the CEO having to take time away from that delivery work to fundraise, and often they're sort of fundraising from 6 months to a year. It's really tricky. I think that there's a really interesting opportunity, and I'd like to get more into this around impact investment communities and really waking them up to that conversation that we had earlier about the need to not just fund the solutions, but fund the advocacy to create the political conditions in which your solutions and your investments can thrive and accelerate. And I think that's something that polluting industries have always done well. They put marketing budget into advocacy to create social conditions in which their investments thrive, whereas green business and green tech, I guess the nuance there is these companies are often emerging and reinvesting money into growing the business. But I think as time goes on, and if anybody has any ideas about businesses who are wanting to fund more, I absolutely think that the corporate sector can play a much bigger role here. I think there has been fear in the past of being too political for corporates, but really, if people are taking their climate responsibilities seriously, I think that's absolutely something that we could work on a lot more to get not just philanthropy, but corporate philanthropy really mobilized on this. Climate Emergency Fund in the States are an interesting model, but they fund more the kind of very traditionally they have funded direct action kind of XR groups. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. The Australian climate movement needs slightly different strategies. XR is one part of that strategy, but it's not the whole. We need a lot of in-track work as well because of how conservative our politics has been. It's a really interesting question, and it's one that I scratch my head about every night, how to get more funding. Any ideas? I'd take them. Please do share.
I was just wondering, it's easy to get behind and marketing and have advocates to promote things that are going to give you profits in the long term or at some stage. That's easy to get behind. But I suppose from a storytelling perspective, we probably have got more to lose and we'll end up with bigger costs than any profits that the corporates could ever think to make with, well, a whole bunch of stuff. The cost of not doing anything at the moment way outweighs the benefits that petrol companies and basically the bad economy is going to make in future years. But I suppose in your storytelling, really, it really resonated. It is all about that story and the narrative behind it. But as long as people don't think about the cost of not doing, of not taking action, then it's going to be a very hard one because it's not as sexy as having a $10 million profit in a couple of years' time, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And I think the climate risk narrative is something we need to tell more and tell better. Absolutely. And it's incredible, really, like in the finance sector, how much that conversation is still like a niche dialogue rather than something that people are actively. We were recently at a ESG conference down in Tasmania. So wealth managers, investment managers talking about ESG and responsibilities. And some people were, all in and taking this issue very seriously and really recognizing the absolute nonsensical situation of risk balancing that's going on. And they're, 100% of their portfolios are going towards market solutions, towards climate change. And, like these portfolio, like there's so many hundreds of $1 million being directed to market solutions. We could have a fraction of that going towards these kinds of solutions, we'd be in a different place. But more to the point, just on the investment side, there are people there talking about mobilizing capital to make money, and going into great new green technologies and new markets. Phenomenal. Alongside them, there were also a number of talks within an ESG branded conference with wealth managers and investment managers talking about 5 or 10% going into ESG businesses, while the other 85% of their portfolios could be funding anything from fossil fuels to arms. There's definitely a hell of a lot of coal, oil and gas. So there's a big piece of work to be done in finance, and the people working on it are still very much the minority. So absolutely get amongst that. It's a huge area.
Because of short-term thinking, short-term profits, and they do understand that they need to be seen as addressing ESG. So they'll do whatever it takes to tick that box. But then ultimately, they're there to make a profit in the short term because that pays them their salaries and bonuses.
Yeah. And you're right, like it's the frameworks that we operate within, right? And the frameworks that they're operating within is that business as usual is okay. We just have to do a little bit more. So again, connecting those people with the reality of climate science is a very important thing to do. And unfortunately, the sort of the endless growth narrative just doesn't work on a finite planet. So the way that we teach economics at university, at schools, like a lot of universities around the world are still talking about endless growth. We're not talking about circularity or anything like that. So the culture of the way that institutions and sectors normalize this really needs a complete paradigm shift. But triage, transition, transformation, what are the horizons that we're working across? Where do you start? And we start by moving as much money to the good stuff and as much money out of the bad stuff as we possibly can, and doing, dancing between those horizons at once. In fact, there's a great, do you know Nate Hagens? Have you heard of him? I might just put a link in here. He's a really interesting thinker. He's an ex-Wall Street banker, and now he talks about how to move through. He talks about the sort of complexity that we've introduced into global systems and economic systems, and possible ways out. He references Star Wars and Star Trek a lot, and Lord of the Rings a lot. So his stories, I think, could do a bit of could have a bit of strengthening his cultural frameworks, but there's some interesting thinking there too.
At least he tries.
Absolutely, he's brilliant. He's actually brilliant. Okay, any other questions?
Arielle, maybe if there's any way for folks here to reach you afterwards, if you mind popping that into the
Absolutely.
chat.
Yeah, sure thing.
And just to maybe be mindful of everyone's time, we can probably end here. And otherwise, I'm sure we'll be continuing to discuss for a lot longer.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about. So nice to meet you all and to have good chats. Thanks so much for coming along. And if you have any questions or want another chat, please do reach out. I've popped my email in there and our website, so take a look.
Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Arielle.
Thanks so much for having me, Shamali.
Bye-bye.
Right, goodbye. Bye.
Bye.